Welcome to my channel, Whodunnit channel.
The Body Beneath the Stone Bridge. A Hamish Macbeth mystery. If there was one thing Hamish Macbeth disliked more than paperwork, it was the sort of weather that encouraged people to become energetic. The morning had dawned bright. Not the harsh brightness found in English holiday brochures, but a cool Highland light that washed the mountains in pale silver and left ribbons of mist curling lazily over the loch. Ben Arbor stood watch beyond the village like an elderly laird pretending to be asleep while observing every trespasser. The sea loch breathed gently against the rocks, gulls argued overhead, and the wind carried the smell of peat smoke from half the chimneys in Lochdubh. Hamish regarded the sunshine with suspicion. Bright weather tempted headquarters in Strathbane to believe country policemen ought to be doing visible work. He preferred rain. Rain kept tourists indoors, discouraged complaints, and gave everyone an excuse to postpone unpleasant tasks. His dog Lugs stretched lazily outside the police station, one ear twitching at flies before deciding they required too much effort to chase. "You've the right idea," Hamish muttered. Inside the tiny station sat a stack of reports that had somehow multiplied overnight. Hamish eyed them with the quiet despair normally reserved for dental appointments. A telephone stood beside them. It might ring. It usually did whenever Chief Inspector Blair had discovered a fresh reason to shout. Hamish quietly lifted the receiver. He laid it carefully beside the telephone. Silence. Perfect. He poured himself another mug of coffee. The coffee wasn't particularly good, but it was hot, black, and plentiful, which were the three qualities Hamish respected most in beverages. Lugs wandered inside. "Fancy a walk?" The dog wagged his tail. Officially, Hamish intended to inspect the riverbanks for signs of illegal fishing. Unofficially, he intended to see whether Angus MacLean had left any salmon hidden beneath the old rowing boat as promised. The Highlands rewarded patience. So did poachers. The path toward the river wound through blooming gorse that painted the hillsides yellow. Sheep grazed with profound concentration, while crows argued from fence posts like village politicians. Lochdubh itself remained wonderfully unchanged. The post office had opened 10 minutes late. Mrs. Wellington was already sweeping the same front step she had swept every morning for the last 20 years. The minister cycled carefully down the main street, looking as though he expected temptation to leap from behind every hedge. The hotel displayed precisely 2 guests eating breakfast by the window. One was asleep in his porridge. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Hamish approved. He nodded to everyone without appearing in any particular hurry. People often mistook his leisurely pace for laziness. It suited him. People talked freely around lazy policemen. No one ever guarded their tongue near someone who looked more interested in his next meal than in solving crimes. Mrs. Wellington leaned over her gate. "Morning, Hamish." "Morning. Young Kenny Fraser says somebody's buying McBride House." Hamish stopped. "That's so. Aye, Englishman." There was the slightest pause before she pronounced the final word. In the Highlands, one did not necessarily dislike English people. One merely waited for them to prove themselves. "And wealthy?" she continued darkly. "Worse and worse." She sniffed. "They're arriving today." Hamish smiled faintly. Every few years, someone from London discovered Scotland. They bought ancient houses, installed fashionable kitchens, complained about sheep, attempted to improve everyone. Most departed before the second winter. The Highlands had remarkable patience. It usually won. The river sparkled beneath the old stone bridge. Angus MacLean emerged from behind a willow carrying an innocent expression. No Highlander carrying such an expression had ever been entirely innocent. "Mornin', Hamish. Mornin'. Fine weather." "Aye." Neither mentioned salmon. After several comfortable moments of silence, Angus casually nudged a burlap sack with his boot. "I found this abandoned." "So you did. It'd be a shame if it spoiled." "It surely would." Hamish picked up the sack. Inside lay 2 magnificent salmon. Lugs looked deeply impressed. "You're a public-spirited man, Angus." "I try." They separated without another word. Complicated conversations were generally unnecessary among Highlanders. By late morning, Hamish reached the Lochdubh Hotel. Mrs. McGregor looked up from polishing glasses. "You've breakfasted?" "Several times." "You look hungry." "I usually do." She placed a plate of bacon, eggs, fried bread, and black pudding before him. Hamish considered her one of civilization's greatest achievements. As he settled beside the window, the sound of an expensive motorcar drifted into the village. Heads turned simultaneously. Even Lugs raised one ear. The vehicle glided to a stop outside the hotel. It was long, black, spotless. entirely unsuited to Highland roads. A chauffeur climbed out first. Then the passenger emerged. He was perhaps 60, tall, silver-haired, perfectly dressed despite the dust of travel. His camel overcoat probably cost more than Hamish earned in 6 months. He surveyed Lochdubh with the expression of a man inspecting property he intended to improve. Mrs. McGregor sighed. Oh dear. Hamish continued eating. The newcomer entered. Good heavens. His voice carried effortlessly through the dining room. I was told this establishment possessed character. Mrs. McGregor smiled with dangerous sweetness. We've plenty. I meant standards. The standards come after the character. He ignored the remark. I require the best room. You've reserved it. I certainly hope so. His gaze settled briefly upon Hamish. Constable? Police. Excellent. I doubt that. The Englishman frowned. I'm sorry. Hamish smiled pleasantly. I was talking about the weather. I wasn't. No? I said excellent because one naturally expects rural crime. Hamish sipped his coffee. Do you? Petty theft. Occasionally. Vandalism. Rare enough. Poaching. Never heard of it. The slightest flicker touched Hamish's eyes. Mrs. McGregor looked determinedly at the ceiling. The visitor introduced himself. My name is Charles Barrington. He waited. No one reacted. I own Barrington Capital. Mrs. Morning Tybrigaunmon. McGregor continued polishing glasses. Hamish buttered toast. Barrington appeared mildly offended. I've recently purchased McBride House. So we've heard, said Mrs. McGregor. I intend to transform the estate. Into what? Hamish wondered privately. A golf course? A wellness retreat? One of those fashionable spas where wealthy people voluntarily sat in cold water. Barrington smiled confidently. I believe Lochdubh possesses enormous unrealized commercial potential. The silence that followed might have frozen whiskey. Mrs. McGregor finally spoke. We've always managed. I don't doubt it. Nevertheless, progress is inevitable. Hamish glanced toward the window. Outside, several villagers had found excellent reasons to linger nearby. None appeared to be looking at the hotel. All were listening. Barrington continued. I shall be introducing improvements. Such as? Hamish asked mildly. A marina. Mrs. McGregor dropped a spoon. A luxury lodge complex. Someone outside coughed violently. A modern bridge across the river. Hamish slowly looked up. The old stone bridge is historically significant. It is obsolete. It's older than London. Nonsense. No, Hamish replied quietly. Only slightly younger. Barrington laughed. I appreciate local sentiment. His tone suggested he appreciated it in much the same way one appreciated children's drawings. But emotion cannot obstruct development. Hamish finished his breakfast. The Highlands possessed long memories. Villagers could forgive almost anything except being patronized. Barrington had accomplished in 3 minutes what normally required several months. He had united the entire village against him. Quite an achievement. That afternoon Barrington toured McBride House with surveyors from Inverness. He criticized everything. The walls, the roof, the view, even the sheep. They look neglected. Donald Fraser, whose family had raised sheep since before Barrington's ancestors had discovered forks, merely nodded politely. We'll mention it to them. Barrington failed to notice the joke. By evening nearly everyone in Lochdubh had met him. Nearly everyone disliked him. The stories multiplied rapidly. He intended to fence off ancient walking paths. He wanted to demolish the fishing hut. He'd suggested replacing Highland cattle with alpacas. No one knew which stories were true anymore. It scarcely mattered. The damage had been done, as sunset painted the hills in deep gold. Hamish walked home beside the river with lugs padding faithfully at his heels. The old stone bridge cast a long shadow across the water. It had stood there for centuries. Generations had crossed it. Lovers had carved initials into its stones. Children had fished beneath it. Old men had leaned against its parapet, discussing weather that had long since passed into memory. Hamish rested one hand upon the cool granite. It'll likely outlast the lot of us. Lugs gave a sleepy bark. The evening settled peacefully over Lochdubh. Smoke curled from cottages. Someone played a fiddle in the distance. The tide whispered against the shore. For a moment, Hamish allowed himself to believe tomorrow would be as quiet as today. He should have known better. By this time tomorrow, the old stone bridge would guard a terrible secret, and the peace of Lochdubh would be broken by murder. The following morning arrived, wrapped in the sort of drizzle that drifted sideways, carried by a wind that seemed to have developed a personal dislike of umbrellas. Hamish approved immensely. The sunshine had vanished. The tourists remained indoors, and Lochdubh had settled back into its proper colors of grey stone, dark water, and green hills disappearing into low cloud. He stood outside the police station nursing a mug of coffee while Luggs sniffed industriously at a patch of wet grass. A respectable day, Hamish observed. Luggs sneezed. The telephone inside began ringing. Hamish looked thoughtfully toward the hills. It continued ringing. One might answer immediately, of course, but that only encouraged callers to expect efficiency. By the time he wandered back indoors, the ringing had stopped. He replaced the receiver where it belonged. A minute later it rang again. Hamish sighed. Police. Blair's voice exploded down the line. Macbeth, where the devil have ye been? Outside. I've been trying to reach you for 10 minutes. The weather's better out there. I've a report from headquarters that some rich English businessman's making complaints already. That'll be Mr. Barrington. He says the village is full of lazy idiots. Hamish considered this. He'll no be making himself popular. I don't care whether he's popular. I care because he's influential. If he rings me again saying you're doing nothing, I'll have your hide. I'm doing something. What? Hamish looked around the empty office. I'm answering the telephone. There was a dangerous silence. Then Blair roared something unprintable, before slamming the receiver down. Hamish smiled faintly. His day was already improving. By mid-morning, Barrington had indeed succeeded in making himself even less welcome. Hamish encountered him near the harbour, where two fishermen were repairing lobster pots. Barrington stood with folded arms, while a young surveyor balanced a clipboard beneath an umbrella. This entire waterfront is inefficient, Barrington declared. Neither fisherman answered. The sheds should be demolished. Still silence. A restaurant here, he pointed. Boutique shops there. Another gesture. Perhaps a private marina extending into the loch. One fisherman finally looked up. I? You disagree? The old fisherman scratched his beard. No. Barrington looked pleased. I simply wondered where ye planned to put the sea. His companion burst into laughter. Barrington stared blankly, failing to understand. Hamish continued walking before anyone noticed him smiling. Gossip travelled faster than the postal service. By lunchtime, every cottage contained fresh reports. Barrington had dismissed the village school as quaint. He intended to purchase several crofts. He had offered Mrs. Wellington money for her cottage. She had apparently informed him exactly where he might build his marina. The language she had employed became considerably stronger with each retelling. Hamish spent the afternoon wandering through the village in no particular hurry. To outsiders, it looked aimless. To Hamish, it was work. He stopped at the post office for stamps he did not need. He accepted tea from Mrs. Wellington. He chatted with the minister about the rain. He admired a repaired fishing net. Every conversation drifted naturally toward Charles Barrington. He's offended half the village already, observed Mrs. Wellington. Only half. The day's young. At the garage, Willie Lamont shook his head. Asked me if Highland roads could be widened. They can. They'd stop being Highland roads. Hamish nodded. There was wisdom in that. Later that afternoon he wandered up the winding drive toward McBride House. The estate had once belonged to an old Highland family whose fortunes had slowly evaporated over generations until the property had finally been sold. It remained handsome, despite neglect. Grey stone walls rose above ancient yews. The windows overlooked the loch. The gardens had become pleasantly wild. Barrington appeared determined to tame them. Gardeners hacked at overgrown shrubs. Builders unloaded equipment. Surveyors measured walls. The place already sounded different. Too busy. Too loud. Barrington spotted Hamish approaching. Constable. Mr. Barrington, I've been meaning to speak with you. So have I. You first. Barrington frowned. I've discovered people crossing my property. They've always crossed it. They'll stop. Hamish regarded him calmly. The footpath's older than the house. I own the land. Not the right of way. Barrington's expression hardened. I've instructed solicitors. I'm sure they'll enjoy the scenery. The businessman ignored the remark. I also want additional police patrols. For what? Theft. What was stolen? My patience. Hamish waited. Barrington realized the answer had failed to impress. My tools were moved. Missing? No. Damaged? No. Just moved. They were stacked differently. Hamish looked toward the builders. One of them avoided his gaze. You don't seem concerned. I usually become concerned after the crime. Barrington let out an irritated breath. No wonder nothing gets done. Hamish merely tipped his cap and wandered away. He had learned very little, except that Barrington was making enemies among his own workers now. That might prove useful. As evening settled over Lochdubh, rain finally ceased. The clouds broke apart just enough for a pale sunset to spill across the water. Hamish decided to take the longer path home. Lugs trotted happily ahead, pausing every so often to investigate rabbits that invariably escaped before he reached them. The old stone bridge stood quiet as ever. Water rushed beneath its weathered arches. The river had risen overnight, swirling brown around moss-covered rocks. Hamish leaned against the parapet. He often came here when he wanted to think. The bridge had a calming effect. People crossing it slowed down without realizing why. Perhaps centuries of footsteps lingered in the stones. Lugs suddenly stopped. His ears stood erect. What is it? The dog gave a low growl. Not frightened, interested. Hamish followed his gaze. Far downstream, just beyond a bend where alder trees crowded the bank, a figure emerged briefly from the mist. Someone wearing a dark waterproof coat. They appeared to be dragging something awkward through the wet grass. A rolled carpet, perhaps. Or heavy canvas. The distance was too great to tell. Hamish watched. The figure paused, looked around, then disappeared among the trees. Lugs whined softly. Hamish considered walking down for a closer look. Then he glanced at the sky. The light was fading quickly. The riverbank below was steep, slippery, and half-flooded. If someone was merely moving equipment, he would look ridiculous stumbling through the mud to investigate. If they were poachers, they were already gone. He memorized the location instead. One learned to trust dogs. One also learned not to rush. Tomorrow would be soon enough. As he turned away, he noticed something else. Fresh tire tracks. Large ones, far larger than the tractors usually used around Lochdubh. They led toward the bridge, then back toward the main road. He crouched, touching the wet impression with one finger. Very recent. The rain had almost, but not quite, washed away their sharp edges. Lugs sniffed them, then looked uneasily toward the darkening trees. Hamish rose slowly. Come along. The dog obeyed, though he glanced back more than once. Behind them, beneath the ancient bridge, the swollen river churned noisily around its stone pillars, concealing whatever had disturbed Lug's keen nose. By dawn, the water would surrender its secret. The mist settled over Lochdubh before dawn like a woolen blanket thrown across the glen. It muffled every sound except the steady rush of the river beneath the old stone bridge. The hills had disappeared entirely, leaving only ghostly outlines of cottages and the occasional yellow glow from a kitchen window where early risers brewed tea against the chill. Hamish Macbeth awoke to persistent scratching at his bedroom door. Lugs, the dog, rarely demanded attention before sunrise. Hamish pulled on yesterday's trousers, reached automatically for the kettle, then noticed Lugs pacing in restless circles. What has gotten into ye this morning? The dog barked once and hurried outside. Hamish frowned. Lugs had inherited none of the frantic habits common to town dogs. If he became agitated, there was usually a reason. Coffee would have to wait. That alone convinced Hamish something unusual was afoot. He buttoned his waterproof jacket and followed the dog into the damp morning air. The village remained almost silent. Only the gulls complained. Lugs trotted purposefully toward the river, instead of taking his usual wandering route through the main street. So we're going back, are we? The dog did not look back. Hamish's thoughts returned to the figure he had glimpsed the previous evening. Perhaps someone had been dumping rubbish. Perhaps fishermen had left equipment beside the bank. Or perhaps it had been nothing at all. Experience had taught him that dismissing a curious instinct usually led to regretting it. The narrow path grew slippery beneath his boots. Water dripped steadily from branches overhead. As they approached the bridge, Lug suddenly broke into a run. Hamish quickened his pace. The dog stopped near the downstream side of the bridge, whining softly, while staring toward a tangle of reeds caught against one of the ancient stone supports. The river had risen again during the night. Branches, weeds, and driftwood had gathered against the arch. Among them floated something darker, something that did not move with the current. Hamish climbed carefully down the muddy embankment, gripping exposed tree roots for balance. Halfway down he stopped. A polished black shoe protruded from beneath the reeds. His expression barely changed. Stay. Lugs obeyed reluctantly. Hamish continued, until he reached the water's edge. The current tugged at his boots as he crouched. The body lay wedged against the bridge support, face downward, one arm trapped beneath a heavy branch. An expensive overcoat billowed gently in the water like dark seaweed. There was no need to turn the body over. Hamish already knew. Charles Barrington. For several long seconds he simply watched the river, not because he expected the dead man to move, but because rushing achieved nothing. The Highlands had their own rhythm. Death did not change it. He finally knelt and examined what he could without disturbing the body. Barrington's wristwatch remained in place. A thick gold ring still gleamed on one finger. His wallet bulged inside an inside pocket. Robbery seemed unlikely. A shallow scrape marked one hand, as though he had tried to grasp rough stone. His hat was missing. More interesting was the bridge itself. Hamish slowly raised his eyes. The moss growing along the parapet had been freshly disturbed. Tiny fragments of stone lay scattered near the edge. Someone, or something, had gone over recently. Whether by accident or force remained to be seen. He climbed back to the path and walked to the nearest telephone box. Mrs. Wellington, already sweeping her doorstep despite the early hour, looked up. "You're out early." "Aye." She studied his face. Years of village life had taught her to recognize trouble. "What is it?" Hamish removed his cap. "I'm afraid we've a dead man." The broom slipped from her hands. "Who?" "Mr. Barrington." Her mouth fell open. For perhaps the first time in living memory, Mrs. Wellington had no immediate reply. "I'll ring Strathbane," Hamish said quietly. Within 20 minutes, the peaceful silence of Lochdubh had shattered. Word spread from doorstep to doorstep faster than the telephone could carry it. Fishermen abandoned their boats. Shopkeepers left customers waiting. Curtains twitched all along the waterfront. Everyone drifted toward the old bridge, stopping well short of the police cordon Hamish hastily erected with rope borrowed from the harbour. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Only yesterday the wealthy Englishman had been striding through the village announcing grand plans. Now he lay beneath the very bridge he had dismissed as obsolete. There was something grimly fitting about it, though Hamish disliked such thoughts. The dead deserved fairness, however unpleasant they had been in life. The distant growl of engines echoed through the glen. Hamish looked up the road. 3 police vehicles rounded the bend in quick succession. The lead car stopped with unnecessary force, spraying wet gravel. The driver's door flew open. Detective Chief Inspector Blair emerged already shouting before both feet reached the ground. "Macbeth!" His voice rolled across the river like thunder. "What in God's name have you managed now?" Hamish sighed almost imperceptibly. "My morning was going rather well until about half an hour ago." Blair's face turned an alarming shade of crimson. "Don't stand there making jokes. Where's the body?" Hamish pointed silently toward the bridge. Blair stomped forward, trailed by 2 detectives struggling to keep pace while carrying notebooks and camera equipment. Villagers instinctively stepped aside. No one looked pleased to see him. Blair scarcely noticed. He glanced at the corpse for less than 10 seconds before straightening. "English businessman," he grunted. "Aye. Plenty of enemies already, so it would seem." Blair jabbed a thick finger toward the crowd gathering beyond the rope. "Round them all up. All of them. They hated him, didn't they?" "Most did. There ye are." Hamish looked once more at the silent river. Blair had arrived only moments before, and had already decided the entire village was guilty. It was exactly what Hamish had expected. And, he suspected, exactly what the real killer had been hoping for. Blair wasted no time turning orderly confusion into noisy chaos. "Nobody leaves the village," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "I want statements from every man, woman and child who so much as looked at the deceased." One of the younger detectives hesitated. "Sir, every child? Did I stutter?" "No, sir." "Then get on with it." The detective hurried away. Hamish stood quietly beside Luggs, hands in his pockets, watching the familiar performance unfold. Blair always mistook volume for authority. It was one of the few dependable things in life, rather like Highland rain or midges. Within half an hour, the bridge resembled a village fair, though with considerably less cheerfulness. Detectives marched people back and forth. Photographers snapped endless pictures. A constable carefully measured footprints that had already been trampled by half a dozen policemen. Blair barked contradictory orders so rapidly that no one could possibly obey all of them. Hamish remained where he was, until Blair finally noticed. "What are ye doing standing there, Macbeth?" "Watching." "I can see that. Start making yourself useful." "I was waiting to hear what useful looks like." Blair glared. "Search the riverbank." "I've already done that." "What did ye find?" "A body." Several detectives coughed into their sleeves. Blair's face darkened another shade. "Smart Alec." He stomped away before Hamish could answer. Luggs wagged his tail. "I know." Hamish murmured. "Best not laugh." The body was eventually lifted from the river with considerable effort. Dr. Brodie, the local doctor, waited nearby beneath a dripping umbrella. He examined Barrington briefly before looking toward Hamish. "Definitely dead. I'd have been disappointed if he had reached another conclusion." The doctor smiled faintly. "He didn't simply drown." "No? There's a nasty blow to the back of the head." Hamish's attention sharpened. Could he have fallen first? Possibly. But the wound could just as easily have come before he entered the water. Blair overheard the final sentence. "There!" he shouted triumphantly. "Murder." Nobody had seriously been considering anything else. Blair puffed himself up. "I'll have the murderer before nightfall." Hamish privately doubted it. Blair generally arrested someone within 24 hours. Whether that person had committed the crime was another matter entirely. The detectives began interviewing witnesses inside the hotel. Mrs. McGregor kept pouring tea despite nobody asking for any. She believed no proper investigation should occur without refreshments. Blair accepted 3 cups while insulting the quality of each. Hamish sat quietly in a corner, saying almost nothing. People forgot he was listening. That suited him perfectly. The first builder questioned admitted Barrington had argued with nearly everyone on the estate. He wanted everything faster. "What sort of arguments?" Blair demanded. "About wages." "Anything else?" "He fired 2 men yesterday." Blair scribbled furiously. "Aha," the builder blinked. "They'd only worked half a day. Names, Tom Fraser and Alec Morrison." Blair slammed his notebook shut. "Excellent." Hamish frowned slightly. "Too excellent. Life rarely arranged itself so conveniently." Outside, rain began again. Not heavy rain, just the steady Highland drizzle that soaked through clothing with quiet determination. Hamish wandered across to McBride House, while Blair remained occupied, collecting dramatic statements. The estate felt strangely subdued. The gardeners worked in silence. The builders spoke only in whispers. Death had a way of shrinking even the loudest workplace. Hamish found the foreman standing beside a stack of timber. "Morning." "Hardly." "Fair enough." The foreman rubbed tired eyes. "I've never seen a man make so many enemies in 2 days." "Did anyone threaten him?" The foreman hesitated. "Aye." "Who?" "Depends what ye call threatening." "Tell me." "He insulted Donald Fraser." Hamish smiled faintly. "So has everyone." "He accused Willie Lamont of cheating." "Anyone else?" "He told one of the gardeners she'd be dismissed because flowers weren't profitable." Hamish nodded slowly. The list continued. By the end of 10 minutes, nearly every employee had argued with Barrington. Curiously, none described the arguments with genuine hatred, only exhaustion. Barrington had been difficult, demanding, arrogant, but hardly worth killing. Hamish tucked that thought away. He wandered through the gardens. The rain had washed the flower beds clean. Fresh footprints crossed the muddy paths. Most belonged to heavy work boots. One set caught his attention. Much smaller. Elegant. The narrow heel suggested an expensive woman's boot. Odd. He followed the prints toward a side entrance. They disappeared beneath the stone steps where the ground became sheltered from rain. Hamish crouched. There, caught against the edge of the lowest step, lay a tiny silver button. Not from a workman's coat, far too decorative. He picked it up. A delicate pattern had been engraved across its surface. Expensive. Recently torn away. He slipped it carefully into his pocket. No announcement. No excitement. Merely another small puzzle. Inside the house, Barrington's study looked as though a storm had blown through. Not overturned. Not burgled. Simply disturbed. Architectural drawings covered the desk. Maps of Lochdubh lay spread across the floor. Several letters had been opened hastily. Hamish examined them without touching. Most concerned planning applications, construction contracts, financial estimates. Nothing unusual. Then his eye caught a photograph standing face down upon the fireplace. He turned it over. It showed Barrington standing beside a smiling woman perhaps 25 years younger than himself. Elegant. Dark-haired. Beautiful. Neither looked especially happy. The frame had cracked recently. Someone had dropped it. Hamish noticed another detail. The woman's face had been lightly scratched. Not enough to destroy the photograph. Just enough to suggest anger. Interesting. Very interesting. As he stepped back outside, he found Elspeth Grant climbing out of her little car, notebook tucked beneath one arm. The reporter smiled. "I heard. I imagined you might. Blair tried to stop me entering the village." "Did he?" "He told me journalists were parasites." "And what did you tell him?" "That I couldn't quote him unless he spoke more clearly." Hamish laughed. "How's his blood pressure?" "I expect alarming." She looked toward the silent house. "Do you think someone here killed him?" "I think someone wanted him dead." "That's not quite the same thing." "No." She studied him for a moment. "You're thinking." "I usually am." "What about?" Hamish looked back toward the muddy path where the elegant footprints had disappeared. "About someone who doesn't belong among builders' boots." And why they came here in the rain." Before Elspeth could ask another question, An angry shout drifted across the estate. "Blair! Again!" Hamish sighed. "That'll be my summons." As they walked toward the front gate, Blair marched across the lawn waving a notebook. "I've got him." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "So soon? Donald Fraser? The shepherd?" He threatened Barrington yesterday in front of witnesses. Hamish remembered the conversation. Donald had calmly remarked that the Highlands had buried more stubborn men than Charles Barrington. It had sounded more like history than a threat. Blair, however, smelled victory. The man's practically confessed. Did he? He admitted he was furious. So was half the village. Blair ignored him. "I'm arresting Fraser immediately." Hamish watched Blair stride confidently toward his car. Luggs gave a low, uncertain growl. Hamish reached down to scratch the dog's head. "No," he said quietly, his eyes lingering on the silver button in his pocket. "Blair's chasing the loudest anger." He glanced back once more at McBride House. The killer left behind something much quieter. Donald Fraser accepted his arrest with the weary resignation of a man who had spent 60 years living in the Highlands and understood that arguing with authority rarely improved matters. He was mending a stone wall when Blair's convoy rolled into his croft. Sheep scattered across the hillside. The detectives climbed out with considerably more drama than the occasion required. Blair strode forward, as though capturing a notorious outlaw, instead of a shepherd in mud-spattered boots. "Donald Fraser, I'm arresting ye on suspicion of murdering Charles Barrington." Donald rested another stone carefully into the wall before looking up. "Morning, Blair. Did ye hear what I said?" "Aye, and," Donald considered the question, "I'd rather finish this section of wall first." Blair's face turned crimson. "Have ye lost your senses?" "No. But if I leave it half done, the sheep will." Even Hamish struggled to suppress a smile. The detectives exchanged uncertain glances. Blair snatched the older man's arm. "Save your jokes for the courtroom." Donald brushed the dust from his jacket before allowing himself to be led to the police car. As he climbed inside, he looked at Hamish. "I suppose they're wanting a solicitor." "It would nae hurt." Donald nodded. "I've never killed anybody." "I know." Blair slammed the car door. "We'll see about that." The convoy disappeared down the narrow road toward Lochdubh. Hamish remained beside the half-built wall. Luggs sniffed thoughtfully at the scattered stones. "Wrong man," Hamish murmured. The dog wagged his tail as if agreeing. By afternoon, the news had spread through every cottage. Lochdubh did not believe Donald Fraser was a murderer. Donald had been many things over the years. Stubborn, occasionally ill-tempered, and known to argue over grazing rights until sunset. But violence was another matter entirely. Mrs. Wellington voiced what everyone else was thinking. If Donald had wanted the fellow dead, he'd have told him beforehand. There was a certain Highland logic in that. Hamish accepted another cup of tea. One never refused tea during an investigation. People tended to remember useful things while pouring it. Mrs. Wellington lowered her voice. "I saw a woman." Hamish looked up without appearing particularly interested. "When?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Where?" "Leaving McBride House." "What sort of woman?" "Smartly dressed." She frowned. "Too smart for Lochdubh." "Can you describe her?" "Dark coat." "Age?" 40, perhaps. "Local?" "Oh, goodness, no." She shook her head firmly. She walked as though she expected pavements. Hamish smiled inwardly. Highlanders judged outsiders by details invisible to everyone else. "Did she have a car?" "A silver motor." "Did you recognize her?" "No." Mrs. Wellington hesitated. There was something else. Hamish waited. She was crying. That caught his attention. "You're certain?" "I've eyes, haven't I?" "Aye." She kept wiping her face before driving away. "Interesting. Very interesting." He finished his tea. Instead of returning directly to the station, Hamish drove slowly toward McBride House. The estate had quietened considerably. Only a handful of workers remained. The foreman greeted him with a tired nod. "Back again?" "I forgot to ask something." "What?" "Did Mr. Barrington receive any visitors yesterday?" The foreman scratched his chin. "There was a lady." Hamish's expression remained neutral. "Yesterday afternoon?" "Aye." "Did you hear her name?" "No." "Were they expecting her?" "I don't think so." "What makes you say that?" The foreman pointed toward the front steps. "They argued before she even got inside." "What about?" "Couldn't hear." "Loud?" "Not exactly." He searched for the right word. "Intense." "How long did she stay?" "Half an hour, and afterwards, she drove away." The foreman frowned. "Mr. Barrington looked shaken." "Angry?" "No." "Frightened?" Hamish looked toward the house. That was a word he had not expected. Inside the drawing room, Rain tapped gently against tall windows. Everything remained exactly as Blair's detectives had left it, untidy. Hamish wandered without purpose, or so it would have appeared. He stopped beside a writing desk, opened a drawer, closed it again, looked at a bookshelf. Nothing. Then he noticed a waste paper basket. Most people searched desks. Very few searched rubbish. Inside lay torn pieces of thick cream paper. Not many. Perhaps half a letter. Someone had ripped it carefully into small fragments. Hamish emptied the basket onto the desk. Patiently, piece by piece, he began fitting them together. 20 minutes later, the fragments formed enough of a message to read. Cannot continue pretending. You promised, if your wife discovers. The signature had been torn away completely. Hamish read the surviving lines twice. Then a third time. So, not business. Personal. He folded the fragments carefully into an envelope. Lugs, lying by the fire, lifted one ear. "Aye," Hamish said softly. "So much for planning disputes." As he left the house, Elspeth Grant pulled into the drive once more. "You've that look." "What look?" "The one that means you've found something." "I've found questions." "Same thing, usually." She fell into step beside him. "The newspapers in Inverness already have Donald Fraser convicted. They're in a hurry. So's Blair." Hamish nodded. "That worries me." Elspeth studied him. "What are you not telling me?" Hamish looked toward the hills. "Suppose a man's building plans upset an entire village." "All right. But something else frightened him." "The woman?" "Perhaps. The letter." Hamish glanced sideways. "I didn't mention a letter. You didn't need to." She smiled. "You've got your thoughtful face." He laughed quietly. "You're becoming observant. I learned from the best." That evening, Hamish sat alone in the police station, with a fresh pot of coffee. Lugs snored beside the stove. Rain rattled softly against the windows. The village had settled into uneasy silence. He spread everything he knew across the desk. A rough map. Barrington's photograph. His notebook. The silver button. The reconstructed letter. One by one he arranged them. Everyone had focused on Barrington's arguments. Yet arguments were ordinary. People quarreled every day. Murder required something deeper. Fear. Desperation. Secrets. His eyes returned to the silver button. It did not belong to a workman's coat, nor to Barrington's clothing. Someone elegant had visited. Someone who had left in tears. Someone connected to a letter mentioning a wife. Hamish leaned back slowly. Barrington had introduced himself to Lochdubh as a wealthy developer. Perhaps that was only half the story. Perhaps the person who had arrived yesterday afternoon knew the other half. The telephone rang sharply, breaking the silence. Hamish picked up the receiver. "Police," a woman's voice answered. Soft, controlled, almost whispering. "Are you Constable Macbeth?" "I am. I've just heard about Mr. Barrington." "Who is this?" A pause. Long enough for him to hear rain striking the caller's window. "I think," she said quietly, "I may have made a terrible mistake." Before Hamish could ask another question, the line went dead. He slowly lowered the receiver. No name, no explanation, only a frightened voice. Outside, unnoticed by anyone inside the station, a solitary figure stood across the street beneath a black umbrella. They watched the light burning in Hamish's office for several moments. Then they turned and disappeared into the Highland night. Hamish remained perfectly still after replacing the receiver. Most policemen, he reflected, disliked anonymous telephone calls because they contained too little information. Hamish liked them for precisely the same reason. People rarely telephoned the police anonymously unless they were frightened. And frightened people usually knew something worth hearing. He poured himself another cup of coffee before the kettle had properly boiled. It was weak enough to disappoint almost anyone else, but it gave him something to occupy his hands while he thought. Lugs raised his head. "What do you think?" The dog thumped his tail once against the floorboards before returning to sleep. Helpful as always. Outside, the rain had stopped again. The silence settling over Lochdubh felt different now, less peaceful, as though the village itself were waiting. The next morning, Blair arrived in a foul temper. That, at least, was reassuringly normal. He burst into the police station carrying a thick folder under one arm. "I've got enough to charge Fraser." Hamish looked up from his breakfast. "Morning. Did ye hear me? I heard shouting. The Crown Prosecutor will thank me for this." Hamish buttered another piece of toast. "What have you got?" 3 witnesses heard Fraser threaten Barrington. They heard him disagree. He admitted he hated the man. So did half the village. Blair slapped the folder onto the desk. "And Fraser can't account for where he was between 7 and 9 last night." Hamish looked mildly interested. Can anyone? Blair ignored the question. The man's guilty. What was the murder weapon? We're looking. What time did Barrington die? The doctor will tell us. What evidence puts Fraser at the bridge? Blair's face hardened. Macbeth, are ye questioning my investigation? I was asking. I've solved bigger cases than this. I've noticed. Blair leaned forward. If you've something useful to contribute, now's the time. Hamish thought briefly about the silver button, the torn letter, the anonymous caller. Then he shook his head. Nothing certain. Then stay out of my way. Blair swept out again. The station became pleasantly quiet. Hamish finished his toast. There was no advantage in arguing. Blair only listened after proving himself wrong. Instead of revisiting the bridge, Hamish drove to the village garage. Willie Lamont was bent over the engine of an aging Land Rover. Without looking up, he said, "Morning. Morning. You're here about Barrington?" "Aye." Willie wiped his hands on an oily rag. "I've already told Blair everything." "I'm sure you have." He didn't listen. "I usually do." That earned Hamish a faint smile. Willie nodded toward the office. "Tea. I'd never refuse." They settled beside a battered workbench while the kettle boiled. Hamish waited. Eventually Willie spoke. Barrington wasn't driving his own motor. No. He'd hired a chauffeur from Inverness. "I heard. The chauffeur came here yesterday morning. For repairs. A puncture." Hamish looked up. "Which tire?" "Rear offside." "What caused it?" Willie frowned. "Odd thing. It wasn't road damage. What was it?" "A nail. Nails happen." "Aye." He paused. But this one had been hammered upright. Hamish's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Deliberately. "Looks that way. So someone wanted the tire punctured." Willie nodded. "Or wanted to delay the car." That was considerably more interesting. "Did Blair ask about that?" "He was too busy asking whether I argued with Barrington." "And did you?" "Only about paying the bill." Hamish left with more questions than answers. Someone had sabotaged Barrington's car before his death. Not to kill him. Simply to delay him. Why? His thoughts returned to the unknown woman. Perhaps timing mattered. Perhaps she had expected him to be somewhere else. Or perhaps someone else had. He drove toward Inverness. Not because he expected miracles, but because anonymous callers seldom came from nowhere. The hired chauffeur lived in a neat cottage on the edge of the city. A careful-looking man named Malcolm Reed answered the door. His expression changed the instant Hamish mentioned Barrington. "I was wondering when someone would come." "You've spoken to the police." "The other police? Detective Chief Inspector Blair." Malcolm winced. "The loud gentleman. That's him. He never asked me much." "What would you have liked him to ask?" Malcolm stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Over tea, Malcolm recounted the previous day carefully. "I collected Mr. Barrington from the hotel yesterday morning. What was his mood?" "Excellent." "And later?" "He became distracted." "When?" "After a telephone call." Hamish leaned forward slightly. "What sort of call?" "I couldn't hear much. But," he kept saying, "no, not here, absolutely not." "What happened afterwards?" "He cancelled 2 meetings." "Did he say why?" "No." Malcolm hesitated. "There was one other thing." Hamish waited. "The lady." "What lady?" "The one who visited McBride House." "You saw her?" "I drove her from Inverness." That made Hamish's attention sharpen considerably. "Did you know her?" "No." "Can you describe her?" "Elegant, dark hair." "Aye." "Age?" 40, perhaps. "What was her name?" Malcolm shook his head. "She asked me not to speak during the journey." "Was she upset?" "Not then. And afterwards, when I drove her back." He paused. "She cried almost the entire way." "Did she say anything?" "Only once." "What?" Malcolm repeated the sentence exactly. "He'll never leave her." I was a fool to believe him. Hamish looked quietly into his untouched tea. There it was. Not proof, but direction. The torn letter, the scratched photograph, the mysterious woman, Barrington's fear. Pieces that had floated separately were beginning to drift together. The drive back to Lochdubh was slow. Low clouds clung to the mountains. The loch shimmered beneath a cold breeze. Hamish barely noticed the scenery. He was thinking about relationships. Affairs rarely stayed tidy. People lied, made promises, broke them. Sometimes they became desperate. He reached the village just before sunset. Elspeth was waiting outside the hotel. "Well? You've been spying." "I've been waiting." "Same thing." She smiled. "You found something." "I found someone who drove Barrington's visitor." "And?" "She believed Barrington intended to leave his wife." Elspeth's smile faded. "But he wasn't going to." "So it seems." She looked toward the dark outline of McBride House. "A jealous lover?" "Perhaps." "It feels too easy." Hamish nodded. So does Donald Fraser. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Hamish's gaze drifted toward the old stone bridge. Something caught the fading light, a brief metallic glint beneath the downstream arch. Too bright to be wet stone. Too regular to be natural. Without a word, he started toward the river. Elspeth followed. Lugs bounded ahead, barking excitedly. The object lay half buried in mud, where the river level had fallen since the body was recovered. Hamish knelt. Carefully, he pulled it free. It was a woman's wristwatch. Expensive. The crystal was cracked. One side of the leather strap had been torn away violently, as though ripped from someone's wrist during a struggle. On the back, engraved in tiny elegant letters, were 3 initials. E.H. Hamish stared at them for several seconds. He had never met anyone in Lochdubh whose name matched those initials, which meant the watch almost certainly belonged to the woman who had visited Barrington. And if it had been torn from her wrist beneath the old bridge, then she had been there at the very moment Charles Barrington died. Hamish slipped the watch into a handkerchief before placing it carefully in his pocket. He did not show it to Elspeth immediately, not because he distrusted her, but because information had a curious way of traveling through Lochdubh. Even the most conscientious reporter could accidentally reveal that the police had found something important, and once that happened, the real value of a discovery often vanished. Elspeth noticed the movement. Well, something dropped into the mud. Useful? It might be. Might? Hamish smiled. I've learned not to become too excited until I've had another cup of coffee. She laughed. That's your answer to everything. It usually works. As they walked back toward the village, Hamish looked once over his shoulder at the old bridge. The lowering tide had exposed more of the muddy bank than the previous day. If the watch had only just become visible, there might be something else hidden beneath the silt. He made a quiet note to return early the following morning before Blair decided to conduct another enthusiastic search. The police station smelled pleasantly of peat smoke and fresh coffee. Lugs settled beside the stove, while Hamish spread the latest pieces of the puzzle across his desk: the silver button, the torn letter, the scratched photograph. Now the wristwatch engraved with the initials E.H. He turned the watch over in his hands. It had stopped at exactly 7:42. Water sometimes stopped a watch immediately. Sometimes it continued for hours. The time itself meant little, but the broken strap interested him. It had not simply worn through. Someone had pulled it hard enough to tear the leather clean away. A struggle, or an attempt to stop someone leaving. His thoughts were interrupted by another ring of the telephone. This time the caller identified herself. Constable Macbeth. My name is Eleanor Hastings. Hamish's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the receiver. The initials. E.H. I understand you're investigating Charles Barrington's death. I am. I believe we should meet. There was fear in her voice. Real fear. Where are you? In Inverness. I can come. No. Her answer came too quickly. It wouldn't be safe. Safe for whom? Silence. Then she said quietly, I don't think Charles was the person your inspector believes he was. Before Hamish could ask another question, she added, tomorrow, 11 o'clock, the cafe beside the railway station. The line went dead. Hamish remained staring at the receiver. Lugs opened one eye. I know. The dog thumped his tail. Things were becoming interesting. The following morning Blair arrived looking unusually pleased with himself. That alone put Hamish on his guard. I've got new evidence. Congratulations. Blair ignored the remark. We searched Barrington's office again. And? We found a ledger. What sort of ledger? Payments. Hamish listened. There are large sums paid to local businesses. So? Bribes. Or invoices. Blair snorted. Always defending these villagers. I'm defending possibilities. Blair slapped the file shut. Doesn't matter. Fraser's still my man. Hamish nodded vaguely while reaching for his coat. Where are you going? Blair demanded. Following up an inquiry. What inquiry? A quiet one. Blair narrowed his eyes. I want ye back by lunchtime. I'll try. It was a wonderfully non-committal promise. The cafe beside Inverness railway station was warm, crowded, and smelled strongly of fresh baking. Hamish arrived 5 minutes early. Old habit. He chose a table facing both the entrance and the windows. At precisely 11 o'clock, a woman entered. She paused just inside the door, scanning the room. Dark hair, elegant navy coat, perhaps 40. She looked exactly as Mrs. Wellington and the chauffeur had described. Her eyes betrayed 2 sleepless nights. She approached cautiously. Constable Macbeth. Hamish. She sat. I'm Eleanor Hastings. The initials on the watch. No surprise there. What can you tell me? She looked around before speaking. I had an affair with Charles. I'd guessed. I ended it months ago. But he didn't. She lowered her eyes. No. The waitress arrived with coffee. Neither touched it. Eleanor took a deep breath. Charles promised to leave his wife. He didn't. No. Her voice carried more sadness than anger. I finally realized he never intended to. Hamish said nothing. People filled silence with truth. Sure enough, Eleanor continued. I went to McBride House to end everything. The argument. She looked up sharply. You know about that? Enough. I told him it was over. What did he say? He laughed. Her fingers tightened around the untouched coffee cup. He said I'd come back. Did you? No. Were you at the bridge that evening? For the first time, genuine panic crossed her face. Who told you that? Hamish reached slowly into his pocket. Without a word, he placed the broken wristwatch on the table. Color drained from her face. Oh God. Is it yours? She nodded. I thought I'd lost it. How? She closed her eyes. He followed me. To the bridge? Yes. What happened? I wanted to leave. And he grabbed my arm. She looked at the torn strap. I pulled away. The watch came off. Did you push him? No. The answer came instantly. I swear I didn't. What happened after the watch broke? I ran. You left him alive? Yes. She leaned forward desperately. He was shouting after me. Did you look back? No. Did you see anyone else? She hesitated, just long enough for Hamish to notice. You remembered something. There was. She swallowed. A car. What sort? I don't know. Color? Dark. Did you see who was inside? No. But I heard a door slam. Hamish's mind began assembling the pieces. Someone had arrived after Eleanor fled. Someone Barrington had been expecting, or fearing. Why didn't you tell the police? She gave a bitter smile. Because I knew exactly how it would sound. She was right. Blair would have arrested her before she finished the first sentence. Hamish studied her quietly. She had lied. She had concealed evidence. But he no longer believed she had killed Charles Barrington. One question remained. Mrs. Hastings. She looked up. You're married. Yes. Does your husband know about Charles? A shadow crossed her face. No. Would he have reason to hate him? He never knew. Hamish nodded slowly. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone else did. As Eleanor reached into her handbag for a handkerchief, a folded envelope slipped onto the table. She hurried to pick it up. Too late. Hamish had already seen the handwriting on the front. It matched the torn fragments he had reconstructed from Barrington's waste paper basket. She noticed his expression and sighed. I suppose there's no point hiding this either. She handed him the envelope. It's the last letter Charles ever sent me. Hamish opened it carefully. Halfway through reading, he stopped. His calm expression changed almost imperceptibly. The letter contained nothing romantic. Instead, it ended with a single chilling sentence. If anything happens to me, it won't be because of you. There is someone else who has discovered what I've been doing. Hamish folded the letter slowly. The affair, he realized, had never been the real motive. It had merely distracted everyone, including the killer, from the far more dangerous secret Charles Barrington had been carrying. Hamish folded the letter with the same care one might use for an old family photograph. He slipped it into his inside pocket, without another word. Eleanor watched him anxiously. You don't think I killed him? It was not quite a question. Hamish finished his coffee before answering. I think you've been frightened enough to make poor decisions. I should have gone to the police. Aye. But you didn't kill him. Tears welled briefly in her eyes, though she blinked them away. I never wanted him dead. I believe you. She let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding since the previous evening. Then who did? Hamish smiled faintly. If I knew that, I'd be missing a perfectly good afternoon. Despite herself, she gave a small laugh. He stood. If you remember anything else, however small, ring me directly. I will. And Mrs. Hastings. She paused at the cafe door. Don't discuss this meeting with anyone. Her face tightened. You think someone is watching? I've learned not to ignore that possibility. The drive back to Lochdubh took longer than usual. Hamish stopped twice. Once to admire the view. Once because he wished to think. The second stop lasted considerably longer than the first. He parked beside a stretch of moor overlooking the sea loch. The wind bent the heather into gentle waves, and patches of sunlight wandered across distant hills before disappearing beneath gathering clouds. Barrington's last letter occupied his thoughts. There is someone else who has discovered what I've been doing. Not who he had loved. Not who he had offended. What he had been doing. That was entirely different. Hamish took out his notebook. Across the top of a clean page he wrote only 3 words. What was Charles hiding? Below it he listed everything he knew: property development, planning applications, arguments with villagers, the affair, the anonymous telephone call, the sabotaged tire, the mysterious visitor. He stared at the list. One item refused to fit with the others: the punctured tire. If someone intended to murder Barrington, why merely delay his car? Unless, Hamish tapped the pencil thoughtfully, unless they needed him to arrive somewhere at a particular time. He underlined the word time. When he reached McBride House, Blair's detectives were once again searching every room with remarkable enthusiasm and limited success. Blair himself emerged from the library, carrying a cardboard box overflowing with papers. "There ye are. I've been away, so I noticed." Blair looked enormously pleased. "We're taking every document. Every one." "Aye. What are you looking for?" "We'll know when we find it." Hamish nodded. That was, in its own way, a remarkably honest answer. Blair thrust a folder toward one of his detectives. "Get this lot back to Strathbane." The detective hurried away. As the box was lifted, a single rolled-up map slipped unnoticed onto the polished floor. Everyone except Hamish walked past it. He bent casually, picked it up, and glanced at the title: Proposed Lochdubh Coastal Development. Nothing remarkable, until he noticed several handwritten markings in red pencil. They did not indicate buildings. They marked ownership boundaries. Several had circles beside them. One property in particular had been underlined repeatedly: Donald Fraser's Croft. Curious. Hamish quietly rolled the map again. "Missed one," he called. The detective thanked him and took it without looking. Outside, Willie Lamont was repairing a tractor. He looked up as Hamish approached. "Still chasing ghosts? Sometimes ghosts leave footprints." Willie chuckled. "I've remembered something." Hamish stopped. "What?" "The morning Barrington's tire was punctured." "Aye. There was another motor parked opposite the garage." "What sort?" "A dark saloon." "Anyone inside?" "A woman." Hamish's interest sharpened. "Eleanor Hastings?" "No." "Certain?" "Different hair." "What color?" "Fair." "Did she come into the garage?" "No." "What did she do?" Willie frowned. "She was watching." "Watching whom?" "Barrington." "Did they speak?" "Not while I saw." "Registration number?" Willie shook his head. "I only remember the last two letters." "What were they?" "H and K." It was little enough, yet somehow it felt important. Two women. One dark-haired, one fair. Only one had admitted being there. That evening Elspeth arrived at the police station carrying a notebook and 2 paper bags. "I've brought supper." Hamish looked inside. "Mrs. McGregor's steak pie. And coffee." "I may have to marry you." "I've heard that line before." "So have I." They laughed. Luggs positioned himself hopefully beneath the table. As they ate, Elspeth leafed through her notebook. "I've been asking questions in Inverness. Officially? When have I ever done anything officially?" Hamish smiled. "What did you learn?" "Barrington Capital wasn't doing very well." That surprised him. "I thought he was wealthy." "So did everyone." She handed over several pages of notes. 3 projects failed last year." Hamish skimmed them. "Heavy debts." "Exactly. I thought he was buying half the Highlands." "So did the banks." Hamish looked up. "You mean, they believed he had investors, and he didn't?" Elspeth shrugged. "Nobody seems quite sure." She lowered her voice. "One former employee told me Barrington was desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. They also make enemies." Hamish nodded thoughtfully. The image of an arrogant millionaire was beginning to crumble. Perhaps Barrington had been bluffing. If so, someone had discovered it. Long after Elspeth had gone home, Hamish remained alone at his desk. Rain drummed softly on the windows. The stove crackled. Luggs slept without concern. Hamish spread a fresh sheet of paper before him. For the first time since the investigation began, he ignored the names of suspects. Instead, he wrote a timeline. Morning, tire deliberately punctured. Afternoon, argument with Eleanor Hastings. Evening, meeting at the bridge. Later, death. Then he stopped. Something was missing. He searched through Barrington's diary once again. Most appointments had been crossed out. One remained, written only as 8 p.m. H. Nothing more. No surname. No address, just a single letter. Hamish frowned. Eleanor's surname began with H now, but her first name began with E. Barrington usually wrote first names, not surnames. So who, or what, was H? His eyes drifted toward the window. A movement outside caught his attention. Someone was standing across the road, perfectly still, watching the station. The moment Hamish rose from his chair, The figure turned and hurried into the darkness. Hamish was out the door in seconds, lugs racing ahead. They reached the corner just in time to see a dark car pulling away from the curb. Its headlights disappeared around the bend, too far to catch, too dark to identify. Hamish stopped in the middle of the empty road. Lugs sniffed the damp ground where the stranger had stood. Then the dog began barking toward a nearby litter bin. Hamish walked over. Inside lay a crumpled envelope. It had been dropped only moments earlier. The rain had not yet soaked the paper. He unfolded it carefully. There was no letter inside, only a single newspaper photograph. It showed Charles Barrington, shaking hands with a smiling man outside a newly completed housing development. Across Barrington's face, someone had written in thick black ink, "He was going to tell you everything." For the first time since finding the body beneath the bridge, Hamish felt the unmistakable sensation that the killer was no longer merely covering old tracks. The killer had begun watching him. Hamish carried the photograph back into the station without hurrying. People often imagined detectives raced dramatically from clue to clue. In Hamish's experience, haste mostly resulted in muddy boots and overlooked details. He laid the photograph beneath the desk lamp. Lugs settled beside the stove but kept one eye fixed on the door, his ears twitching at every sound outside. The message had been written with a thick black marker, not elegant handwriting, deliberately clumsy. Someone had tried to disguise their script. Hamish examined the newspaper cutting more closely. Charles Barrington stood beside a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit, both smiling for the camera as they broke ground at a housing development somewhere in England. The other man's face had been left untouched. Only Barrington's image had been defaced. Interesting. If the killer had wanted to frighten Hamish, why leave the second man visible? Unless they had forgotten he mattered, or believed Hamish would not recognize him. He turned the photograph over. On the back was a faint blue stamp from a newspaper archive. Not Inverness, Glasgow. Someone had gone to the trouble of obtaining an old press photograph. That suggested planning rather than panic. The following morning, Blair arrived carrying the expression of a man expecting applause. "Macbeth!" Hamish looked up from his coffee. "I've broken Fraser." "Have you?" He admitted, lying. "About what?" "His movements." Hamish waited. Blair grinned triumphantly. "The fool said he went fishing after supper. And there were no fish. No fish. The river was in flood." Hamish blinked. "That's your contradiction? No one fishes a flooded river." Hamish took another sip of coffee. "Donald does." "What?" "He says trout become careless after heavy rain." Blair stared. "That's ridiculous." "So's Donald." The detective inspector's smile vanished. "You're impossible." "So I've been told." Blair snatched up his folder. "When Fraser confesses, don't expect thanks." "I seldom do." After Blair stormed out, Hamish telephoned Elspeth. "I need a favor." "You've already had 3 this week." "I've lost count." "What is it?" "The man standing beside Barrington in an old newspaper photograph." "Yes, I need his name." "You've finally found something you can't charm out of Mrs. Wellington?" "Even she has limits." Elspeth laughed. "I'll see what I can do, rather than remain in the station." Hamish returned to the bridge. The river had fallen another foot overnight. Mud glistened beneath the ancient arches. He climbed carefully down the bank, while Lugs bounded ahead. The dog stopped suddenly near a patch of flattened reeds. His nose remained fixed on one spot. "What is it?" Hamish crouched. Half buried beneath silt lay a walking stick. Not an ordinary stick cut from woodland. A finely crafted black cane, with a polished silver handle. He lifted it carefully. Heavy. Expensive. The initials, CB, had been engraved beneath the handle. Barrington's. Strange. According to everyone in the village, Barrington had never used a walking stick. Hamish examined the ferrule. Fresh scratches covered the metal tip. More importantly, one side of the polished silver handle bore a distinct dent, as though it had struck something very hard, or someone. He looked back toward the bridge parapet. If Barrington had carried the cane that evening, it might explain the injury on another person, rather than the one on Barrington himself. The thought lingered. Mrs. McGregor was polishing glasses when Hamish entered the hotel. "I hear Blair's still bothering poor Donald." "Aye. He should be ashamed. He rarely is." She poured coffee before he asked. "I've remembered something." Hamish smiled inwardly. People always remembered things after 3 days. The excitement faded. The mind settled. Details returned. What was it? The evening Barrington died. Yes? He wasn't alone at dinner. Hamish paused. "I thought he'd eaten by himself." "So did I." She leaned closer. "He had company for 5 minutes." "A man?" "No." "A woman?" She shook her head. A gentleman. Do you know him? Never saw him before. What did he look like? About your height. That's most men. She smiled. Grey coat. Age? Perhaps 50. Accent? English. What happened? They spoke very quietly. Did they argue? No. Worse. How? The gentleman smiled the whole time. Hamish frowned. And Barrington? He looked terrified. That afternoon Elspeth telephoned. I've got your name. Go on. The man in the photograph. Hamish reached for his notebook. Henry Ashcombe. The name meant nothing. Who is he? Barrington's former business partner. Former? He resigned 2 years ago. Why? There was a pause. Officially, retirement. And unofficially, he accused Barrington of fraud. Hamish sat upright. Fraud. The company denied everything. Were charges brought? No. But the business split apart. Hamish thanked her, and replaced the receiver slowly. Fraud. Debts. Hidden financial problems. Barrington's mysterious letter suddenly looked rather different. Perhaps H in the diary did not refer to a woman at all. Perhaps it referred to Henry. Hamish drove straight to McBride House. He searched Barrington's study again. Not the desk. Not the shelves. This time he searched the fireplace. Most people burned what they wished forgotten. Among the cold ashes he found the corner of a thick envelope that had escaped the flames. Only a few words remained legible. Ashcombe Holdings. Accounts. Criminal liability. The rest had been destroyed. Enough survived. Someone had tried very hard to erase correspondence with Henry Ashcombe. Someone who understood exactly what those papers contained. Hamish carefully wrapped the fragment. As he stood, his eyes wandered toward the bookshelf. One volume sat slightly forward from the others. He pulled it free. Nothing happened. He smiled at himself. Too many detective novels. Then curiosity persuaded him to inspect the empty space behind it. His fingers touched cold metal. A small key. Hidden where only someone searching carefully would find it. No label. No indication of what it opened. Hamish slipped it into his pocket. He had developed a growing respect for small keys. They usually led to large secrets. Darkness had fallen by the time he reached the station. Lugs greeted him enthusiastically before returning to his blanket. Hamish placed the key beside the silver button, the broken watch, the photograph, and the burnt letter fragment. 5 clues, 5 separate threads. Yet they no longer felt separate. Someone had arranged a meeting with Barrington. Someone connected to Henry Ashcombe. Someone desperate to prevent the truth about Barrington's finances from emerging. As he stared at the key, the telephone rang again. This time the caller did not whisper. A man's calm, educated voice filled the line. Constable Macbeth, speaking. You've been asking questions about Charles Barrington. I have. I suggest you stop. Hamish remained silent. It would be healthier. Who is this? You've already found more than you should. The voice remained remarkably composed. Then it added. Tell me, Constable. Have you discovered what the little key opens? Hamish's expression did not change. He had told no one about the key. Not Blair, not Elspeth, not a single soul. Which meant only 2 people could know it existed. The person who had hidden it, or the person who had come back looking for it after Barrington died. The line clicked dead. Hamish slowly replaced the receiver. For the first time, he was certain of one thing. The killer was no longer guessing what he knew. The killer knew exactly which clues Hamish had found, and which one they needed back before he could unlock the truth. The following morning dawned cold and brilliantly clear, as though the Highlands had decided enough rain had fallen for one murder. Mist drifted away from the hills, revealing Lochdubh once more in all its quiet beauty. Fishing boats rocked gently in the harbour. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys. The old stone bridge stood exactly where it had for centuries, indifferent to the secrets it had witnessed only days before. Hamish Macbeth sat outside the police station with a mug of coffee balanced on one knee, while Lugs dozed in the sunshine. To anyone passing, he appeared to be doing nothing at all, which was exactly how he liked it. Inside his jacket pocket rested the small brass key. He had spent most of the previous evening thinking not about who had killed Charles Barrington, but about what the killer believed remained hidden. People murdered for many reasons. They lied for even more. But they only returned to retrieve evidence they feared would expose them. The telephone rang. Hamish ignored it until the 3rd ring. Police, it was Elspeth. I've found Henry Ashcombe. Hamish smiled. I thought you might. He's staying at an hotel in Inverness. Good. And there's something else. I'm listening. He wasn't merely Barrington's former business partner. No. He'd been quietly helping investigators examine Barrington's finances. Barrington had been diverting investors' money through shell companies. Ashcombe intended to confront him with the evidence. Hamish looked across the village toward McBride House. So Barrington knew he was finished. Exactly. But that still doesn't explain murder. No. It explains motive for fear. He thanked her and replaced the receiver. Now every piece finally rested where it belonged. The affair had been real. The debts had been real. The fraud had been real. But none of them had been enough to produce murder. The murder had required one final ingredient. Someone who believed Barrington's confession would destroy them as well. Instead of rushing to confront anyone, Hamish wandered to the hotel. Mrs. McGregor poured coffee without asking. Busy morning? Not particularly. You've that look. What look? The one that means someone's about to have a very bad day. Hamish merely smiled. Would you mind spreading a little gossip? Her eyes brightened. I've some experience. I'd like it known that we've finally opened the locked cabinet at McBride House. She frowned. But you haven't. I know. And that we've found Barrington's missing papers. You haven't found those either. No. Mrs. McGregor's smile slowly widened. Oh, think you can manage it? My dear Hamish. She looked almost offended. Give me an hour. By lunchtime, the rumor had traveled through Lochdubh with astonishing efficiency. By 2 o'clock, it had almost certainly reached the killer. Hamish waited. Waiting was one of his greatest talents. Blair, unfortunately, possessed the opposite talent. He arrived shortly after 3, red-faced as usual. I've had enough, Macbeth. Of your interference. I've hardly spoken. I've charged Fraser. Hamish sighed. You've charged the wrong man. Blair jabbed an accusing finger. Unless you can prove otherwise, this case is finished. I can. Blair laughed. With what? A cup of coffee. What? I'd suggest staying. Blair stared. Then curiosity, one of the few qualities capable of overcoming his temper, won the battle. Hamish had asked several people to come to McBride House. Blair, Elspeth, Mrs. McGregor, Donald Fraser, now temporarily released pending further inquiries, the chauffeur, Malcolm Reed, and one final guest. She arrived exactly on time. A fair-haired woman in an expensive grey coat, calm, elegant, confident. She introduced herself as Helen Ashcombe, the estranged wife of Henry Ashcombe. Hamish watched Blair's expression. The detective looked utterly bewildered. Who the devil is she? The person, Hamish replied quietly. Mr. Barrington expected to meet at 8 o'clock. Helen smiled politely. I'm afraid you've made some mistake. I don't think so. Blair folded his arms. This had better be good. Hamish remained leaning casually against the fireplace. Charles Barrington was not meeting Eleanor Hastings that evening. He looked toward Helen. He was meeting Mrs. Ashcombe. Her smile disappeared. The diary simply recorded H. Blair frowned. So Charles always wrote first names. He continued calmly. Not surnames. Helen said nothing. Hamish reached into his pocket. He placed the small brass key on the table. I wondered what this opened. Silence. So I searched the house again. Blair blinked. You never told me that? No. Hamish continued. It fits the locked dispatch box in Barrington's study. Helen's face became noticeably paler. Inside was not money, another pause, nor jewelry. He laid several folders upon the table. Only account books. Blair stared. The missing financial records. Hamish nodded. They prove Barrington had intended to confess everything to Henry Ashcombe. Helen finally spoke. You can't prove that. No. I can prove something else. He looked directly at her. You learned about the meeting. Her hands tightened around her handbag. You followed Barrington. No. You arrived after Eleanor Hastings fled. Still she remained silent. Barrington told you he intended to admit the fraud. Hamish's voice remained gentle. He also intended to tell your husband exactly who had helped him hide the missing money. Helen closed her eyes briefly. Blair suddenly understood. My God. Hamish nodded. You weren't protecting Barrington. He looked at Helen. You were protecting yourself. The room became perfectly still. Outside, a gull cried somewhere over the loch. Helen gave a short, bitter laugh. He was going to blame me. No. He said he'd save himself. Her composure finally cracked. I handled the accounts because he asked me to. She laughed again, this time almost hysterically. I believed him. No one interrupted. He promised nobody would ever know. Tears appeared. Then he decided to sacrifice me. She looked at Hamish. I only wanted him to keep quiet. What happened at the bridge? I met him. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He laughed. The same laugh Eleanor Hastings had described. He said prison would be easier for a woman than for a businessman. She looked down at her trembling hands. I struck him. With sudden clarity, every clue fell into place. Barrington had raised his silver-handled cane to stop her leaving. She had seized it. The heavy handle had struck the back of his head. He staggered against the old stone parapet. Already dazed, he lost his footing on the rain-slick moss. He toppled over the bridge, striking the stone support, before falling into the river below. "I didn't mean to kill him." "No," Hamish said quietly. "I believe you. But then," she covered her face, "I realized everyone would blame me." "So you went back?" She nodded. "I searched his study, the missing papers. I burned what I could, and came back later for the hidden key." Again she nodded. "When I heard rumors the cabinet had been opened, you panicked." She looked at Hamish with exhausted eyes. "I sent the photograph, the telephone calls. I hoped you'd stop." Hamish shook his head gently. "I seldom do." Blair stepped forward at last. For once there was no shouting. "Helen Ashcombe." His voice sounded almost respectful. "I'm arresting you." She offered no resistance. As she was led quietly from the room, she paused beside Hamish. "I underestimated you. A lot of people do." She managed the faintest smile. So did Charles. The investigation concluded 2 days later. Donald Fraser received a formal apology from exactly no one. Blair announced to headquarters that his team's relentless pressure had solved the case. Hamish expressed complete agreement. Blair accepted the congratulations with remarkable enthusiasm. No one in Lochdubh felt inclined to correct the record. Certainly not Hamish. A week later a letter arrived from headquarters, commendation to DCI Blair and his team. Hamish read it over breakfast. Then he folded it neatly and used it to steady one leg of his wobbly kitchen table. It proved surprisingly useful. Life in Lochdubh resumed its familiar rhythm. Builders departed. McBride House stood empty once more, awaiting an uncertain future. Mrs. McGregor returned to worrying about tourists instead of murder. Mrs. McGregor returned to worrying about tourists instead of murder. Wellington resumed sweeping the same patch of pavement each morning, while collecting every scrap of village gossip. Elspeth published a careful account of the case that somehow revealed almost everything except the parts Hamish preferred left unsaid. One quiet evening Hamish wandered back to the old stone bridge. The river flowed peacefully beneath its ancient arches. No trace remained of the violence that had briefly disturbed it. Lugs sat beside him, tail lazily brushing the grass. Hamish rested one hand on the weathered stone. Still here. The bridge, as always, offered no reply. He looked across the loch, where the last light of the day painted the mountains gold. Lochdubh had survived another outsider, another secret, another murder. And, best of all, another opportunity for promotion had quietly slipped away. Hamish smiled into the Highland evening, finished the last of his coffee, and turned toward home, content that the greatest luxury in the world was not fame or rank, but the simple privilege of remaining exactly where he belonged.